civilians, and probably twice that many injured and carrying the pain of their wounds to their death, maybe 50 or 60 million dead and wounded during the war. And I'm sure that must have bothered Zimmern, but Germany was the enemy and France was the ally. And then immediately after the First World War, suddenly the secret society shifted gears, and now Germany was the ally and France was the enemy, and that was too much for Professor Zimmern, so he dropped out. Now, he was afraid to talk about it, but he told Professor Quigley. And Professor Quigley then spent 20 years researching this. Now, there was one other man. His name was William T. Stead. You remember there were three people in the secret society, Stead and Milner and Brett. How do we know that? Well, fortunately, fortunately, Stead was thrown out of the secret society because he didn't really believe in the Boer War. And so he wrote about it in his diary. And we have the pages from his diary back there, or some of them are reduplicated in This Is America, Desperate Dictatorship, because I've simply taken many of these books and taken the important pages out. And Stead actually talks about how they sat around at his home at Mulberry House in 1891 and plotted how they were going to create the secret society. And then, of course, he has the letters from Rhodes to him in about 1900, talking about the secret society, and he republished those in a book called The Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes. So there's no question at all that secret society was formed, and here we have Stead attesting to it. We have Professor Zimmern attesting to it, and one other man. His name was H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells had actually spent a great deal of time with the members of the secret society. And if you read Wells' great book, it's entitled An Experiment in Autobiography. And Wells tells you that between 1902 and 1908, there were a number of men who met together at a dinner club. And there was Lord Milner, there was Leopold Amory, and the name may not mean much to you, but Amory would have been part of Milner's kindergarten, part of a round table, and he was the man who, in 1939, stood up as a member of Parliament, pointed at Chamberlain and said, "You've been here too long, go." That was what they'd said to Cromwell several hundred years before. And of course, Chamberlain resigned, and of course that brought in Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was part and parcel of this movement. How do we know? Well, first of all, because we have a letter that he wrote to H.G. Wells. We got it out of the Wells Library back at University of Chicago, I think it is, where Churchill says to Wells, "I really can't talk about this outside of this secret circle." Well, Wells, who was in the secret society? Well, there was, in the coefficients that met every week or so for, 6 years, 1902 to 1908. There was Milner, Lord Grey, who was the foreign minister who took England into the war, Lord Brand, who was the CEO of Lazard Brothers, so-called international Jewish banking house. Actually, it was controlled by a member of the Round Table, just as in the United States, Lehman Brothers. Boy, doesn't that sound Jewish? Who was headed by Pete Peterson, a Greek who became chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations for many years. And so they keep those Jewish names out there, and they do it intentionally, so that your attention will be diverted from what this is really all about. But so many of these organizations are actually headed by people who tie into this secret society who are not Jewish at all. So let's, then we had Lord Cecil, and so there were actually 5 people on one side, and they were all part of the British aristocracy. They were the ruling elite, and 3 of them, Brand, Milner, and Leopold Amory, were all part of the Round Table group. On the other side, you had H.G. Wells, you had George Bernard Shaw, you had Bertrand Russell, you had Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and you had the founders of the Fabian Socialists. And they plotted for a number of years how they would bring about a one-world socialist government. In fact, coming out of those meetings, Wells wrote 2 books. One, The Open Conspiracy, and said, we're going to be in charge of Moscow probably long before we control New York. We're going to create a one-world government just exactly as they have in Russia with socialism. The bankers are going to help us. This is The Open Conspiracy by H.G. Wells. The other was a book called The New World Order. and which he talked about how the one world government was coming. Both of these books, according to Wells, in his book, An Experiment in Autobiography, actually came out of those meetings between the ruling aristocracy of England, who were tied into this secret society, and the Fabian socialists. So you saw the socialists from below and the other people from above, and of course Brand tied into banking, Milner was tied into banking, people, and Cecil, Lord Cecil was there, was tied into banking. The most powerful men in England were plotting with the Fabian socialists on how they would bring socialism. Why did they want socialism? Isn't socialism going to take from the rich and give to the poor? No, it's going to bring everybody under the control of the rich. That's what it's really all about, because they always will control the government buying and selling politicians. They did it in England, and they've done it in America. Socialism is said to be a sincere, benevolent, idealistic theory, but it doesn't work without force. And somebody's going to be in control of that socialist society. And even Karl Marx, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, talked about the dictatorship not by the proletariat, but of the proletariat. It was a dictatorship by which the common people would be controlled. And that's really what they were planning on. But H.G. Wells wrote another book. It was called The New Machiavellis. And it was a story, now in novel form, admittedly, but it was the story of a secret society that was headed by a German. It was an English secret society that controlled the English government, that was headed by a German. And of course, Lord Milner was a German. I mean, he was a British citizen, but he was of German extraction. And of course, only fictional, except that Leo Amory, in his diary, refers to that book, and he says, and we have Leo Amory's diary, and he says, hey, H.G. Wells was talking about our group. That was us. So here we have three people who attest to the formation of a secret society in England. Then we have an American. His name was Frederick Howe. And Frederick Howe was at the Paris peace negotiations after the carnage of Europe had come to an end. And he was a real idealist. I mean, he was one of these head-in-the-clouds liberals who could justify the First World War because England had to honor a 50-year-old treaty with Belgium where England promised that they would defend Belgium if attacked. And so treaties were sacred, and if treaties weren't honored, how would we ever have world peace, the world law? How would we ever have the Parliament of Man, the federation of the world? And so Frederick Howe was there in England with Colonel House, and Howe was one of the chief men in this whole movement. It was called the Inquiry. And there you saw Thomas Lamont, who was a partner in J.P. Morgan, and you have John Foster Dulles, and Allen Dulles was there. Christian Herter, you remember Christian Herter became Secretary of State. John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State. Allen Dulles head of the CIA. But all these men, this was 1919. But Howe was there too. And he was asked to go over all of the treaties dealing with Palestine, the Palestine area. And because he was actually President Wilson, and the House wanted him to enter and help with the American input on the negotiations. What did he find? Well, he found, first of all, that the English, who gone into the war because they believed in treaties, world rules, the world law, and treaties were sacred, almost like the Bible. The English had, first of all, promised the Arabs that if they came in on the English side, that they'd give them Palestine. Then they made a secret treaty with the French, and they promised that they'd give the French Palestine. And then they promised to give, through the Balfour Declaration, the Jews Palestine. And they'd given Palestine to three different groups. And suddenly Frederick Howe realized they don't believe in treaties at all. It's all been for nothing. All these people have died. This carnage, this horror. I mean, you talk about warfare. I mean, what happened on the Western Front, and the bayonet charges, the trench warfare. 4 bloody, horrible years. If you've ever read into the stories of the people who were there, horrible, horrible, horrible carnage. It's all been for nothing. And so Frederick Howe said, what was it really all about? And so Frederick Howe thought, well, it has to do with economic imperialism. Maybe it had to do with commercial interests, so that the British would be able, commercial interests would have a better trading advantage over the Germans. Maybe that was what it was about. And then he said that a group of men came to him. They were known as Lord Milner's men, and he named them. They were the men who surrounded the Prime Minister at that time. This is 1919. The Prime Minister of England is Lloyd George. And they said to Frederick Howe, you know, we've got to get you to join with us to create this world government. This is what it's all about. And he said, you know, they didn't even know the meaning of the term economic imperialism. And they told him the war had nothing to do with economic imperialism. It had to do with the white man's burden to rule the world. The white man has to rule the world. That's our obligation. That's our destiny. And that's why the war had to be fought to its conclusion. Because without that, they wouldn't have destroyed the existing social structure of Europe. It's all there, Confessions of a Reformer.